A single steel cable, 3/4 of an inch thick, wound tight around a spinning drum, can store enough violence to cut a grown man in half before his brain even registers that something is wrong. No exaggeration required. Just physics. And for almost 70 years, physics was also a Tuesday. Picture the machine first. A squat iron beast the size of a boxcar, sweating steam, sitting on its own wooden skids in a clearing hacked out of trees older than the country around them. It has no wheels. It does not need them. It drags itself forward by its own cable, inch by inch, like something that learned to crawl before it learned to stand. Men called it the donkey, not because it was small, because, next to the trees it was built to conquer, it looked almost too modest to be dangerous. It was not modest. In the woods of the Pacific coast, from the redwoods of Eureka to the rainforests of the Olympic Peninsula, this machine tore down more board feet of timber than any single invention before it, and it did the tearing with a coil of steel rope that could, in a fraction of a second, turn from a working tool into something closer to a scythe. Loggers had a saying for a cable coming apart under load. The line was singing. It was not a compliment, and every man on the crew knew exactly what it meant. Here is the question underneath everything that follows, and we are not going to answer it yet. How does a length of ordinary steel cable, doing precisely what it was built to do, become the single deadliest object in an entire American industry for the better part of a century? How fast does it move once it lets go? How far can it reach? And why did an entire industry keep using a tool that every single man on the crew already knew could kill him, shift after shift, for the better part of 70 years? Not a design flaw hidden in a blueprint somewhere, not a corner cut by a cheap company trying to save $1. The cable worked exactly as intended. That was the problem. This is the story of the steam donkey, the machine that hauled the Pacific Coast's forests out of the ground one log at a time, made a handful of lumber barons rich beyond reckoning, and along the way turned an ordinary tool of the trade into a weapon the men beneath it had to survive, shift after shift, for decades. Some of those machines are still out there right now, rotting quietly in second-growth forest, cables long gone, boilers filling slowly with rust and rainwater. We will get to that too. But first, the unbelievable part. And before we move on, if this kind of history is your kind of thing, go ahead and subscribe. It helps keep videos like this one coming. Now, let's get into it. The machine that ate 20 oxen and kept score in blood. One machine did the work of 20 oxen. Not 10, 20. A single logging outfit on Puget Sound, before steam power arrived, needed a full team of draft animals and the men to drive them just to drag one log at a time down a greased skid road. The donkey needed one operator, a small crew, and a fire. Call it what it actually was, an extinction event for an entire category of labor, compressed into roughly 20 years. It could pull a log, a full mile through standing timber, without a single animal setting a hoof in the mud. A mile. Understand what that means on hillsides so steep that horses simply could not stand on them, on ground so torn up by underbrush and stumps that no wagon road could survive a season. The machine did not care. It hauled itself forward on its own cable and kept pulling. And it was, by a wide margin, one of the most dangerous machines an American worker could stand next to. Not eventually dangerous, immediately dangerous, on day one, in ways the men who built it did not fully understand yet. Here is a fact that should stop you cold. The whistle code used to run one of these machines included a specific signal, on its own, reserved only for the moment a man got hurt. 5 long blasts. Not an alarm bell, not a siren. A code, drilled into every crew on the coast, because the event it described happened often enough to need its own dedicated sound. The engine itself could turn into a bomb. These were pressurized steam boilers, built and maintained in the middle of nowhere, hauled up mountainsides on the very skids they rode on. inspected by men with no engineering degree and a great deal of faith. When a boiler let go, it did not injure, it obliterated. But the boiler was not even the machine's favorite way to kill a man. That distinction belonged to something far more ordinary, the cable itself. The same steel line that did the pulling, the hauling, the entire job the machine existed to do, could without warning turn into a weapon that moved faster than a man could flinch. We are going to explain exactly how that happens. Not yet. Hold on to it, because it is the reason this video exists. One old-time logger, according to a museum that still keeps his verdict on record, took one look at his camp's brand-new steam donkey and offered a review that has survived for more than a century. "Get rid of that dribbling pot," he said, "and bring back the bulls." Economics outvoted him almost immediately. Consider the economics for a moment, because they explain everything that comes after. Sawmills paid for logs delivered, not logs delivered carefully. Every minute the donkey sat idle was a minute of profit evaporating into the trees. So the machines ran hard and fast, with crews who had every incentive in the world to keep the cable moving, and very little incentive to slow down and double-check it. And the men standing closest to the danger were often the youngest people on the crew. Whistlepunks, the workers responsible for relaying signals between the felling site and the engine, were frequently teenagers, 16 years old, 17, standing, by the nature of the job, in exactly the stretch of ground where a failure was most likely to reach them. Rules existed to try to prevent all of this. A minimum safety margin was required for the cables themselves, and a clearance zone had to be kept around the engine, free of anything that could catch fire from a spark or get struck by a snapped line. Rules on paper. The woods don't read paper. By the time this machine's reign in the Pacific forests was finished, it had helped fell a share of the West Coast's old growth that is genuinely difficult to say out loud without wincing. It built an industry practically overnight. It also built a body count that most people who have heard the word logging have never once been told about. So how does a machine this useful, this revolutionary, this central to building the modern Pacific coast end up mostly forgotten? Its remains scattered and rusting in forests from California to British Columbia. We're going to answer that too. But we start, like every machine's story should, at the beginning, with the man who built it and the animal he was trying to replace. A naval engineer builds a beast in the redwoods. The redwoods did not care how many oxen you threw at them. By 1864, John Dolbear had partnered with a logger named William Carson and built a sawmill operation in Humboldt County, California, right in the heart of the Redwood Belt. And the Redwood Belt had a problem that no amount of ambition could solve with the tools available at the time. These were not ordinary trees. Some stood taller than anything else living on the continent, wide enough that felling one produced a log too heavy and too enormous for a standard ox team to reliably move. Here is the detail almost nobody expects. The man who eventually solved that problem had spent most of his working life around ships, not trees. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, because it explains the name of the machine that would eventually carry his own reputation into the history books, whether he wanted it there or not. The old method was oxen, sometimes 20 of them on a single haul, dragging a log down a corduroy road of greased wooden ties, one aching step at a time. It worked, in the sense that it got logs to the mill eventually. It also required feeding, housing, and managing a small herd of animals in terrain that could swallow a hoof in mud to the fetlock, and it moved at exactly the speed oxen move, which is to say, not fast, and not on anything resembling a schedule. Dolbear wanted faster. In August of 1881, he built something that had never existed in an American forest before, a single-cylinder steam engine, bolted to a horizontal spool called a gypsy head. The whole assembly mounted on wooden skids so it could be dragged from one worksite to the next. On his first working model, 150 feet of thick manila rope was wrapped several times around that spool. The rope's other end was tied to a downed log. Steam pressure turned the spool. The spool wound in the rope. The log came to the machine. That is the entire idea, and it is almost insultingly simple. It is also the reason 20 oxen suddenly had no job. He called it a donkey engine, borrowing the term from his years around sailing ships, where a small auxiliary steam engine called a donkey was used to run cargo winches and pumps without tying up a ship's main engine. Loggers picked up the name immediately, half because it fit and half because the earliest models genuinely looked too small and unimpressive to be worth a proper horsepower rating. The name stuck so completely that most of the men who used it for the next 70 years never thought twice about where it came from. The patent, when it finally came through on April 18th of 1882, described what was essentially a hoisting apparatus, steam power pulling logs by rope, guided through rollers and pulley blocks, anchored to whatever tree or stump happened to be standing nearby. Unglamorous language for a machine that was about to rewrite the economics of an entire coastline. Word of it spread the way word of a genuine breakthrough spreads in a small, competitive industry, fast and with more than a little skepticism. The Humboldt Times covered it within weeks of that first test, and the paper's own words from July of 1881 still hold up as a fair summary of what everyone in the timber business was quietly wondering. Improvement, the paper wrote, is the order of the day, and there is no reason why the ox team should not make way for the steam engine, as the stagecoach has the railroad engine. That is a newspaper, in real time, watching one era of an industry end and doing the arithmetic on what was coming next. The arithmetic worked out in Dolbear's favor almost immediately. Within a handful of years, donkey engines had become standard equipment at logging operations throughout Washington and Oregon, manufactured under names like the Humboldt, the Tacoma, the Willamette, the Seattle, the Crackerjack, the Duplex, and one machine loggers themselves nicknamed the Half-Breed. An entire regional manufacturing industry had sprung up overnight around a device that did not exist a decade earlier. How fast did that ripple through the wider economy? By 1895, ground-led logging, the method built entirely around this machine, had become the dominant way trees left the forest on the entire Pacific coast. By 1910, timber-related work employed roughly 63% of Washington state's entire wage-earning workforce. By the 1920s, the Pacific Northwest alone accounted for close to a third of all lumber produced in the United States. Numbers that size do not happen because a machine is merely convenient. They happen because a machine changes what is economically possible, and this one did, at almost every level of the industry it touched. It was not only used to drag felled logs to a landing either. The same basic engine, adapted slightly, powered pile drivers on construction sites, slide-back loaders that hoisted logs onto waiting rail cars, and rigs loggers called cherry pickers, sled-mounted cranes built to lift and swing logs the ground crews couldn't otherwise move. One invention, spun off into half a dozen working shapes, all sharing the same steam cylinder and the same spinning drum of cable at the center. But here is the part that gets lost in the enthusiasm of a good invention story. Solving the problem of moving giant, immovable trees did not make the job safe. It made the job fast, and speed, in an industry paid by the board foot rather than by the hour, was about to become its own kind of danger, one that would take a few more years and a great deal of blood to fully reveal itself. Because the same steel that let this machine haul logs a mile through standing timber was, under exactly the right kind of failure, capable of doing something far worse than pulling wood. And that mechanism, the one we asked you to hold on to a few minutes ago, is where we're headed next. The cable was the muscle. The cable was the trap. None of what came next made sense on paper. It only makes sense once you understand what actually happens inside a steel cable under load, and why the men running these machines were, in effect, wrestling something that had never been fully tamed. Start with the plain mechanics, because the plain mechanics are almost boring, right up until they aren't. A firebox burns wood, then coal, then oil, depending on the era and the camp. That heat turns water into steam inside a pressurized boiler. The steam drives a piston. The piston turns a crankshaft. The crankshaft spins a set of gears. The gears turn the main drum, and the main drum winds in the cable. Fire becomes motion, becomes a hauled log. It is the same basic chain of energy that ran half of the industrial world at the turn of the century, just scaled down and dragged into a forest. None of that explains why this specific machine became the deadliest single piece of equipment a logger could stand near. For that, you have to understand what a length of steel cable actually does under load, because it does not behave the way rope behaves in your head. A steel cable pulling a multi-ton log through rough terrain is not a rigid bar transmitting force in a straight line. Under tension, it stretches. Not much, to the eye, but enough. And that stretch stores energy the same way a drawn bow stores energy, the same way a fully compressed spring stores energy, quietly, invisibly, right up until something releases it. So what releases it? Here is where the terrain turns against the machine. A log dragged across open, even ground pulls smoothly, tension rising and falling in a predictable curve. A log snagged on a stump, wedged against a boulder, or caught at an angle around a stand of standing timber, does something else entirely. It holds, resisting the pull, while the donkey keeps applying power and the cable keeps stretching to compensate. Tension climbs and climbs, right up to the moment the obstruction gives way or the cable itself finds its limit. When a loaded cable parts under that kind of stored tension, both ends do not simply drop to the ground. They recoil, snapping backward and outward at a speed that can outrun a man's ability to react, whipping through the air along an arc no one can fully predict in advance, because the exact angle depends on exactly where the failure occurred and exactly how the line was strung at that moment. That whipping steel line is not a falling object. It is a moving one, carrying all the energy the stretch had stored, released all at once, in whatever direction physics decides to send it. The industry knew this. Cables were required to carry a safety margin, engineered so their working load sat at roughly a third of what they could theoretically withstand before failure. In practice, that margin eroded every single day the cable was in use. Rust worked into the strands. Repeated bending around pulley blocks fatigued the steel at the same points, shift after shift. Splices, where two lengths of cable were joined, were consistently the weakest point in the entire system, and every camp had one running somewhere. None of that showed up as a warning sign you could see from 50 feet away. A cable could look completely ordinary and still be a half dozen shifts away from letting go. High lead logging, the method that eventually replaced simple ground dragging, made the physics even less forgiving. In a high lead setup, one end of the cable ran up and over a rigged spar tree, lifting one end of the log clear off the ground entirely, so it could swing over stumps and obstacles instead of catching on them. That elevation solved one problem and created another. It meant the cable was now under tension at an angle, running through blocks mounted high in a tree, and if that cable failed, or if a block itself gave way under the load, whatever let go was doing it from height, adding gravity to an already lethal amount of stored energy. What does 200 feet of elevation do to something already moving fast enough to outrun a man's reflexes? Nothing good. And here is the cruelest part of the entire design. The man controlling all of this, the donkey puncher, sat at the engine, often a considerable distance, sometimes the better part of a mile, from the actual point where the cable met the log. He could not feel the tension building the way a man holding a rope by hand can feel a fish about to break the line. He had gauges, he had experience, and he had a whistle punk relaying signals from someone else's eyes. The entire system ran on second-hand information passed hand to hand across the danger zone, which meant that by the time anyone truly understood a cable was in trouble, it was very often already too late to do anything but get clear. You are standing 40 feet off the main line's path right now, close enough to hear the drum working, close enough to feel it in your boots. 40 feet feels safe. It is not. Nobody standing in these woods in 1910 or 1920 could have told you, with any real precision, exactly how far a parted cable might reach, because it depended on the angle, the tension, and a dozen variables that changed with every single turn of logs. That uncertainty was the actual danger, not the cable itself, the not knowing. That's the debt we opened at the very start, and here it is, paid in full. The machine did not fail because someone built it wrong. It failed because the very thing that made it powerful, a taut steel line storing enormous energy across variable ground, was, by its nature, occasionally going to let that energy go all at once, in a direction nobody could fully predict, faster than any human being could move. Understanding how it worked does not fully prepare you for what it meant to live beside it, shift after shift, for years. That is a different kind of knowledge, and it belonged, entirely, to the men who ran it. 16 years old and standing in the kill zone. The physics explain why the danger existed. They don't explain what it felt like to work 8 feet from it every day for a wage that barely covered board. A donkey engine never ran alone. It ran with a crew, and every position in that crew existed because the machine, for all its power, could not see, could not signal, and could not think. It needed people wired into every link of the chain to make up for that. At the top of the rigging crew sat the hook tender, the most experienced man on site, responsible for choosing how the cables were rigged, directing the choker setters in the field, and making the calls that kept the whole operation moving without killing anyone in the process. Below him, the choker setters did the closest, most physical work, wrapping heavy steel loops, called chokers, around a felled log so the main line could grab it and drag it toward the machine. This put them, by definition, directly in the path the log and the cable were about to travel. At the engine itself sat the donkey puncher, hand on the throttle, eyes on the gauges, responsible for applying exactly the right amount of steam power at exactly the right moment. Too little, and the log wouldn't budge. Too much, applied to a snagged or hung-up log, and you were building the exact kind of stored tension we just spent several minutes explaining how to fear. Between the choker setters and the donkey puncher stood the whistle punk. So who got that job? This is where the age of the workforce gets genuinely uncomfortable to talk about. Whistle punks were routinely teenagers, 16, 17, frequently working their very first job in the timber industry, tasked with relaying a set of coded whistle signals between men who could not see each other and a machine that could not be reasoned with once it started pulling. One short blast to stop everything, 2 short blasts to haul ahead, and that 5 long blast signal for a man down, the one that should never have needed to exist as often as it did. Add to that a spool tender, standing close enough to the spinning main drum to guide the incoming cable with a wooden stick so it wound evenly instead of piling up and jamming, a job that put a human hand within arm's reach of a machine element turning under enormous load. Add a fireman, feeding fuel into the boiler, first wood, later oil, keeping the entire system's pressure exactly where the puncher needed it. In smaller, cheaper outfits, jury-rigged from whatever parts a company could scrounge, loggers had their own name for the whole operation. A haywire outfit, held together, as the phrase implies, with baling wire and stubbornness. Every one of these jobs happened outdoors, in weather that ranged from soaking Pacific rain to bone-dry summer heat, on ground torn up by stumps and slash, miles from the nearest town, in camps that existed purely to serve the logging operation and nothing else. The noise alone was constant, the chuff of the boiler, the grinding of gears, the shriek of cable running over steel sheaves, and under all of it, always, the whistle, cutting through the racket, because it had to be heard over everything else, or someone was going to get hurt. There was, in fairness, a quieter version of this world too. Before the first whistle of the morning, camp sat in a kind of held breath, mist still sitting low in the fir and hemlock, a fireman quietly stoking the boiler back up to pressure, men drinking coffee gone lukewarm in tin cups, nobody talking much, because there wasn't much left to say before a day like this that hadn't already been said the day before. It never lasted past sunup, but for those few minutes, the machine that would spend the rest of the day trying to kill somebody just sat there, ticking and hissing gently to itself, almost peaceful. Then there was the job that had nothing to do with the donkey engine directly, and everything to do with the system it powered. Before high lead logging could even begin at a site, someone had to climb a tree, strip every limb off it by hand, and cut off the very top, turning a 200-foot Douglas fir into a bare spar pole strong enough to anchor the entire rigging system overhead. That someone was called a high climber, and the job amounted to free climbing an enormous, swaying, occasionally rotten tree using nothing but spurs strapped to your boots and a rope looped around the trunk, an axe hanging from your belt the whole way up. The safety codes eventually written around this job read like a list of everything that had already gone wrong, enough times to need a rule against it. Spar trees could not be topped in windy weather. The climber had to be an experienced logger with a thorough knowledge of the entire process. His rope had to be long enough to fully encircle the tree, secured before he ever left the ground, and snap hooks were banned outright unless a secondary safety device backed them up. An entire second set of climbing equipment had to be kept ready at all times. None of these rules existed in a vacuum. Each one was written because a man, somewhere, had fallen or nearly fallen, and the industry had finally decided to write it down. We have a photograph of one of these men doing exactly this work, a high climber named Axel Hallgren, captured partway up a spar tree near Napa, Oregon, at a Big Creek Logging Company camp. An image detailed enough to make out the crosscut saw hanging below him as he worked, published in an Oregonian feature in November of 1921. It is a small thing, a single photograph, but it is one of the few moments where the record hands us an actual face and an actual name to set against a job that mostly survives today as statistics and safety code language. Picture the ordinary version of a working day, because it happened thousands of times over. A whistle punk, new to the job, standing at the edge of a clearing with a signal wire in hand, watching a hook tender check the rigging one more time before giving the go-ahead. The choker's set. The signal goes out, short, then long. Steam hisses somewhere behind the trees, out of sight. The main line begins to draw tight, and everyone standing near it, without needing to be told twice, takes one more step back than feels strictly necessary. Nobody learned that habit from a manual. Every camp taught it the same way, passed down from whatever had already happened to the last man who didn't take that extra step. That was the job. Not glamorous, not, most days, dramatic. Just a long, loud, physically brutal shift spent standing close to a machine that was, by design, occasionally going to try to kill someone, and doing the work anyway, because the wage was steady and the alternative back in town usually paid less. But most days carries an asterisk in this industry, because eventually, on any given crew, on any given cutting, the day arrived that wasn't ordinary at all. We still haven't told you what happens when the line actually lets go, only what it does in theory. Theory and a real camp full of real men are about to stop being the same conversation. The day the line let go. Picture one version of it, because across 70 years, in one shape or another, this happened more times than any single camp ever kept a full count of. The choker is set on a log, wedged hard against a stump. The whistle punk relays the signal, haul ahead. Steam pressure climbs, the drum turns, and out along the line, the cable draws tight, then tighter, holding a tension no man standing nearby can see or measure. For a second, maybe two, nothing happens. The log doesn't move. The cable doesn't look any different than it did a minute ago. Then the stump gives way, or the cable does, and however many 100 feet of stretched steel, carrying every bit of energy it just spent building, snaps back through the air, faster than anyone within 100 feet has time to duck. Whoever the line finds does not get a warning first. There is only the whistle afterward, 5 long blasts, called out into air that has already gone quiet. Every crew carried its own private list of near misses just like it. The shifts where the line groaned but held, where the boiler gauge crept somewhere nobody liked, where a hung-up log finally gave way half a second before anyone expected it to. How many of those does a crew get before its luck runs out? Sooner or later, on enough crews, across enough years, eld stopped being the word that applied. No single accident defines the steam donkey's reign in the Pacific forests, and that is, in its own way, the whole point. It killed steadily instead, in small numbers, camp after camp, season after season, for the better part of 7 decades, until the accumulated total became one of the defining, quietly terrible facts of an entire regional industry. One historian who spent years combing through accident reports, industrial insurance filings, and old logging camp records eventually gave his study of this coast's timber industry a title that sounds, at first, like exaggeration. It isn't. He called it more deadly than war. Read that again slowly. A peacetime American industry, running in the woods a short drive from ordinary towns, that a serious historian could examine, weigh against the casualty rates of actual armed combat, and conclude the forest came out worse. The index of that same book, if you ever get your hands on a copy, reads less like a table of contents and more like a wound log. Crushed, fatal accidents, feet, fingers, instantly killed. Page after page of the plainest words in the English language, doing the job no euphemism could soften. The cable failures we just walked through were only one entry on a longer list of ways this machine could turn on the people running it. The boiler was another, and a separate one entirely. These were pressurized steam vessels, hauled into remote terrain, fired continuously for hours at a stretch, inspected by crews with practical experience but rarely formal engineering training, in an era before boiler safety codes had fully caught up with the machines already in the field. When a boiler failed catastrophically, it did not injure the way falling debris injures. It detonated, throwing metal and scalding steam in every direction at once, and the men closest to it, almost by definition the engine's own crew, had no meaningful chance to get clear in time. And there was a third danger, distinct from both of the others, one that had nothing to do with cables or pressure vessels and everything to do with fire itself. A working steam donkey threw sparks constantly, a simple byproduct of burning fuel under pressure in the middle of dry standing timber. In the Oregon Coast Range alone, across roughly 18 years in the middle of the 20th century, fires linked to logging operations burned through an estimated 355,000 acres of timberland. 2 of those fires, in 1945, the Salmonberry and Wilson River fires, struck in the same year and together consumed 180,000 acres between them. One of those fires reached a logging site worked by the Western Oregon Logging Company, tucked into a remote stretch of the Coast Range south of what is now a simple highway rest area. The crew had bunkhouses out there, ordinary wooden boxcars fitted out as sleeping quarters for men working a remote cut far from any town. When the fire came through, it came fast enough that the entire camp had to be abandoned on short notice. Everything wooden burned. The boxcars burned down to their metal rail frames, and the bed springs from the men's own mattresses were left lying in the ash, the only trace that anyone had ever slept there at all. In the scramble to get the crew clear of the fire, one piece of equipment got left behind entirely: the steam donkey working that site, essential to the operation right up until the moment survival mattered more than salvage. There was no time to load it, no time to drag it clear, no time to do anything but leave it standing exactly where it was and run. The machine that had spent its working life hauling logs out of that exact patch of forest was, in one single afternoon, abandoned to the same forest it had spent years cutting down. Nobody came back for it. Not that year. not for decades. This is the shape the ending took for this machine, again and again, across hundreds of individual logging operations up and down the coast, though rarely with a fire this dramatic attached. No decommissioning, no ceremony, just the moment it stopped making economic sense to keep running steam, and the machine was left exactly where its last shift had ended. Rust started that same week. Nobody was there to stop it. The response to decades of accidents like these, though it came slower than anyone standing in these woods would have liked, was real. Boiler inspection standards, formalized under the American Society of Mechanical Engineers starting in 1914, forced regular checks of pressure integrity and safety valves that simply had not existed as a universal requirement before. Hard hats, introduced commercially in 1919, became standard protective gear across the logging industry. By the 1930s, a small, unglamorous admission that falling debris and cable strikes were common enough to require a helmet, not just good luck. Industrial insurance systems, developed state by state across the Pacific Northwest, began cataloging these deaths and injuries with enough bureaucratic precision that a historian decades later could actually count them, page by page, filing by filing, and arrive at a number that justified a book title as blunt as "More Deadly Than War." None of it happened fast enough to save the men who were already gone by the time each rule was written. That is, uncomfortably, how most industrial safety history works. The rule arrives, drafted in the exact shape of the accident that made it necessary, always one step behind the men it was too late to help. By the time the last steam donkeys were still working anywhere on the coast, the machine's own replacement was already rolling through the same camps on tracks instead of skids, running on diesel instead of steam, and asking almost nothing of the crews who ran it, beyond keeping the fuel tank full. Where the beast sleeps now. So what finally killed the machine that had spent 70 years killing the men who ran it? Not one dramatic invention. The replacement arrived the way most industrial revolutions actually happen. Slowly, then all at once. Through the 1920s, crawler tractors, tracked machines built to spread their weight across soft or uneven ground, proved themselves in logging operation after logging operation as a genuinely economical alternative to steam yarding. They did not need a boiler tended around the clock. They did not need a water supply hauled to the site. They ran on gasoline, and increasingly, as the decade closed, on diesel. Caterpillar, the company most responsible for perfecting this style of machine, began producing a dedicated diesel tractor in 1931. The advantage was stark enough that the company discontinued its own gasoline-powered models within a handful of years, and by 1937 had become the largest diesel engine manufacturer in the world. Logging camps up and down the coast noticed. A tractor could be driven directly to a felled log, hitched and dragged out without a mile of stretched steel cable, without a spar tree rigged overhead, and without a whistle punk relaying signals across a kill zone that no longer needed to exist in the same shape. Tractor logging did not eliminate danger from the timber industry. It never has, and it hasn't yet. But it did retire the steam donkey specifically, and it did it faster than anyone standing beside one of these machines in 1910 could have predicted. By the 1930s, gas and diesel donkeys were already replacing steam models directly. By the 1950s, steam power had vanished from the Pacific Northwest woods entirely. Tractor logging then dominated the industry for roughly 40 years, right up until diesel-powered cable yarders, an updated version of the same basic idea Dolbear had patented back in 1882, quietly returned to steep terrain in the early 1970s, because some hillsides were simply too steep for any tractor to climb. So what happened to the machines themselves once the work stopped? Mostly, nothing happened to them at all. That is the honest answer. When a logging operation moved on or shut down, the steam donkey working that site was frequently too heavy, too remote, and too obsolete to be worth the cost of hauling out. It sat exactly where its last shift had ended, and the forest, patient in a way no company ever was, simply grew back in around it. Remember the donkey abandoned in the panic of the 1945 fire, left standing while its crew ran for their lives. It sat undisturbed in that same stretch of Coast Range forest for more than half a century. Nobody came looking, because nobody had any particular reason to think it was still there. Then, in 2001, an elk hunter working that same remote ground came back from a trip with a story that sounded, in his own words, too good to be true. An abandoned steam donkey, sitting in the woods above the Salmonberry River Canyon, still largely intact. A cultural resource coordinator with a forestry background followed up, made the hike out with a couple of others, and found exactly what the hunter had described. Rusty, yes, but intact, half a century after it had been left to the fire and the rain. The machine that had been abandoned mid-shift eventually became the centerpiece of an exhibit at the Tillamook Forest Center, a piece of hardware that spent 50 years being reclaimed by the same forest it had spent its working life tearing apart. That particular donkey got lucky, in the sense that anything rusting quietly in a rainforest for half a century can be called lucky. Most were not found, or not moved, or simply were not worth the effort. Hikers in the Cascades and Olympics to this day occasionally stumble across a boiler shell, a drum, a tangle of ancient rusted cable, sitting exactly where the crew left it, decades of moss and undergrowth slowly reclaiming iron that once hauled the biggest trees on the continent. There are hiking trails in Washington state today, at Dosewallop State Park and out in Jefferson County, that carry the name Steam Donkey Trail, for the simple reason that walking them means walking directly past what these machines left behind. An old mill pond, a scatter of rusted iron, and not much else. A few did get rescued properly. One, salvaged from a Tacoma area watershed, was reassembled in a small city park in Issaquah, Washington, and now sits dedicated to a local historical society volunteer who spent years arguing that a rusted pile of industrial iron deserved a place of honor rather than a scrapyard. Nearby, a popular paragliding launch called Poo Poo Point still carries the name loggers gave it decades ago, after the distinctive sound a working steam donkey made echoing across that same hillside. The machines are gone. The nickname outlived them. Up near Powell River, British Columbia, another one was found deep in the bush in the summer of 1999, strong enough to be airlifted out just before it would have collapsed where it stood. Further up the coast, at a historic mill site, one steam donkey was restored well enough to actually run again, fired up for a public demonstration in 2009, the only commercially operable steam donkey left anywhere in North America. And back where this entire story started, in Eureka, California, a functioning example still sits on display at a state historic park, built on the exact site of the Dolbear and Carson Mill operation, close enough to where a naval engineer once bolted a steam cylinder to a spool and changed how an entire coastline harvested its trees. So, the machine that turned an ordinary steel cable into something fast enough and lethal enough to kill a man before he could react. That machine did not go out in one final blaze of engineering glory. It went out the way most working machines eventually do, replaced by something cheaper to run, left standing in the rain, and slowly buried under the same forest floor it spent 70 years tearing apart. One log, one cable, one whip crack at a time. They don't build them like that anymore, and considering what it cost the men who ran them, that's probably for the best.